So your objective for topic 4 is to define the types of diffusion, and that's what we're talking about, just the types of diffusion today. So in order to understand these types of diffusion, we first need to understand a couple of terms. The first is hearth. A hearth is an area that a culture or a culture trait develops. So it's like the origin of that culture or culture trait. It's the center, it's where it started. And then from that hearth, culture and culture traits, so like individual traits, whether it's food, religion, an idea, any culture trait, diffuses. So from the hearth, culture traits diffuse. Diffusing is just spreading. So diffusion is the spreading of information, ideas, behaviors, and other aspects of culture. The spreading of culture is what diffusion is. And there are two types of diffusion: relocation and expansion diffusion. And then there are 3 types of expansion diffusion. So relocation diffusion is the spread of a culture trait by people who migrate and carry their culture traits with them. So it has to involve the movement of people, the physical movement of people. And this type of diffusion weakens the hearth because now there's less people in the hearth practicing that culture because they got up and moved. Expansion diffusion is the spread of culture traits through direct or indirect exchange without migration. So with expansion diffusion, the hearth remains strong and the number of people using the trait or culture or participating in it grows because they're not leaving the hearth. It's still there. It's just spreading to everybody else now. Now there are 3 types of expansion diffusion that we are going to look at. So the first type of expansion diffusion is called hierarchical diffusion. It is hard to say, it's kind of awkward, but it's hierarchical diffusion. It's the spread of culture outward from the most interconnected places or from the centers of wealth and importance. Hierarchical diffusion is like a top-down approach. So it starts at its hearth, so the origin of it, wherever it's invented or, the idea comes about. And as it spreads, it doesn't spread to everybody. It only spreads from the most important people down, whether that's because, people can't afford it or different things like that. It starts from the most important people or the most wealthy, and it works its way down. Some examples of that are fashion trends, different fads that, kind of start with a celebrity or a politician. Another more modern form of this that is kind of still being looked at is like social media influencers. A lot of times, if you get an idea or you buy something because a celebrity has it, that's hierarchical diffusion. You probably wouldn't care about it if, a celebrity didn't have it or a celebrity didn't use it. So this is an illustration of hierarchical diffusion. You can see the hearth in green, and the idea or whatever this is spreading, but it's only spreading to certain people. It's skipping some. Hierarchical diffusion cares who you are because it's not for everybody, or the thing that is spreading is not for everybody at the moment. It cares who you are. The next type of expansion diffusion that we're going to talk about, contagious diffusion, it doesn't care who you are. So contagious diffusion occurs when a cultural trait spreads continuously outward from its hearth through contact among people. Some examples of this: a viral video. You don't have to be rich or famous to get your hands on a viral video first. Another example, a disease. It doesn't care who you are. That's why it's called contagious diffusion. If you come in contact with it, you can automatically pick up that culture trait. There's nothing stopping you. And again, you see that in the illustration. From the hearth, it spreads outward. It doesn't care who you are. It's reaching everybody. Whereas in hierarchical diffusion, it was skipping some people. So contagious diffusion does not care who you are. Hierarchical diffusion does care who you are. Recording again. The last type of expansion diffusion is called stimulus diffusion. And, well, stimulus diffusion occurs when people in a culture adopt an idea or a process from another culture. So they adopt a culture trait, but they modify it because part of it just doesn't work for them. An example of this are McDonald's in India. So McDonald's originated in the United States. That is its hearth. I don't know if you ever watched the movie The Founder. It's really good. It's about McDonald's. If you haven't watched it, you should watch it. But we eat beef here, and we eat lots of beef. And so that is what a hamburger is made out of. But in India, their primary religion is Hinduism, and they don't eat beef. But McDonald's spread there anyway. However, they changed their menu. So they don't offer beef burgers. They offer things like the Maharaja Mac. It's like a chicken burger or a veggie burger because they don't offer beef. So this is a culture trait. So fast food, McDonald's, spreading to a place, but it changed. If it doesn't change, it's not stimulus diffusion. If it does change, it is stimulus diffusion. That's what sets it apart. Look at next, now that we understand all the different types of diffusion, is how it diffuses, which is called the means of diffusion. So we're going to get into more detail on this. I think it's actually the next topic, but just in the meantime, you need to know just a few common ways that culture spreads. Historically, it spread through colonialism, imperialism, and trade. Remember Europe conquering the entire world? They spread their culture everywhere through colonialism and imperialism. But now, that's not really how culture is spread. Culture is spread through things like the internet, email, social media, celebrities, TV, radio, movies, smartphones, newspapers, streaming services, music, plays, books, magazines, podcasts. Any way you can get information, that's how it's spread. Now, if you ever have a question, like if there's ever an FRQ question on diffusion, there was one in 2018, actually. There was an FRQ on diffusion. If they ask you about means of diffusion, they will not accept vague terms like media or technology. They want you to be able to name like some of these specific things. So make sure you can name at least like 3 or 4 just so that you kind of have that in your bank on how diffusion spreads. You need to know all of them for historical, but for contemporary, there's so many, it's almost impossible to memorize all of them. But I feel like it would not be hard to remember email, social media, smartphones, and radio. Like those are pretty easy things that you use. Just think of the things that your ideas come from or your thoughts on things come from. Now, it would be nice if everything could just spread as it wanted to, but there are barriers to diffusion. Barriers to diffusion sounds like they're just things that make sure diffusion doesn't happen. However, barriers to diffusion can block things or they can just slow the diffusion, so slow the spread of things. And we're going to talk about these things and kind of how they can block or slow down diffusion. So, barriers to diffusion. Some are distance or physical barriers. With the law or theory of distance decay, we know that the further things are away from each other, the least likely they are to interact. So it makes sense that distance would be a reason that a culture or culture trait would spread more slowly. It would take longer to get there. An age barrier. People of older generations typically aren't open to new ideas, or they don't feel like learning something new. This is particularly evident with the spread of technology. It might not reach them because they don't want it. Like, even if they can access a smartphone, they may not want to because it's too complicated and they don't want to interact with it. That would block that type of diffusion. Linguistic barriers. It would be hard to spread a culture or culture trait if you don't understand what somebody is saying. So that can be a barrier to diffusion. Religious barriers. There are some things that people don't believe or don't like to do or don't think is right because of their religion. So that prevents certain culture traits or ideas from spreading. Political barriers, people's political ideologies, or just laws in general, rules and laws stop things from happening. Folk and local culture, as well as ethnic culture, they're both pretty traditional. And so there are some things that the people who practice those types of cultures aren't going to do. So that will stop or slow the spread of some culture traits. An example, the Amish, you don't use technology. So the TV, smartphones, like that part of culture is not going to spread to them. So they're not going to, even if they come in contact with it, they're not going to pick up that practice. So that is a barrier to diffusion. Social class and economic barriers, just not being able to afford something or not being able to have access to it. And then regulatory barriers. We don't see this a whole lot in the United States, but in a lot of countries, the government can regulate the shows that you watch, what you hear on the radio, the songs you can listen to, what you can see online, because they don't want you to get new ideas. They want you to think what they want you to think. Again, we don't really have that here, but there are in a lot of countries, so that will slow down or block the spread of ideas to a certain group of people. Are there any questions? And after you do your summary, we have an activity that we're going to do that is in Google Classroom.